and welcome. I'm Common Free, and today I'm going to be taking you through a typical chart of mine. If you haven't watched them already, I made a long video about how to track your cycle and use the fertility awareness method to avoid pregnancy, so as a contraceptive method. And then I made a video about tips about taking your temperature, and I made a video about what your temperature tells you and a lot of information around basal body temperature in general. So for today's video, I thought it would be helpful if I literally take a typical cycle of mine and I take you through my chart and the things that I noted and how it looked so that you can see that information be put into practice. Two quick disclaimers before I get into the heart of today's video. The first one is my usual disclaimer, and that is just to say that these videos are me sharing my experience and a little bit of information, but I'm not telling other women what they should and shouldn't be doing with their bodies. So please take what serves you and leave what doesn't serve you. And obviously none of this is medical advice. The second disclaimer is I'm taking you through my menstrual cycle, a typical menstrual cycle. That means I'm going to be discussing things around my body and body fluid and all of those things. So if that is deeply uncomfortable for you, then I suggest maybe you don't watch this particular video, because I would like to freely discuss very natural, very normal bodily functions. And obviously there's a sense of nervousness around doing so. So this is my disclaimer, as to say that stuff's going to be included in this video. If that is weird for you, it's okay if you don't want to watch this video. So I had to go find a typical chart to do for today's video. And I went back through my written journals. I don't use an app to track my cycle anymore. I did previously. I used it for about a year and a half, maybe even longer. Can't remember. But since March 2020, I have kept detailed written journals every single day as opposed to an app. That being said, I do like that apps are quite illustrative, so I will put inserts into this video that shows you an app, but I'm not necessarily using that app to track. Actually, I'm definitely not using that app to track. I will make some videos around comparing the use of an app to my more extensive method. Just decide what works for you and do that. I liked doing the app when it was serving me at a point, and then I wanted more in-depth information, so I decided my freehand journal is my preferred method. Oh, and just a reminder that if you want to track my cycle with me in real time, I post a picture every single day on my story of the date, my cycle day, and my basal body temperature for that day, and I include any comments if there's anything to comment about. So my Instagram is linked down below if you do want to follow that in real time. It's just a nice experience, I think, to learn alongside with. So yeah, we're doing a chart that starts on the 7th of May. I don't know when you're watching this video, but that was more or less 11 months ago. The reason I'm taking a cycle from 11 months ago is because I want to show a typical cycle in today's video. And if you follow my Instagram, you may have known about our roller coaster of a conception journey that has led to some atypical cycles that I will also share with you. Okay, I just quickly had to look for it. 7 May starts in this journal. When tracking your cycle, the first day of your cycle is your first day where you get red blood, which is your period, and not spotting. So the first day of this cycle, my temperature was 36.6 degrees Celsius. That was my first day of red period, but also I don't typically spot, so I don't really have to make a note in a previous cycle around spotting, because that is very unusual for me if I do have that. If anything, there might be a handful of times where I would spot in the morning and I get my period later that day, but I don't have days of spotting leading up to my period. Typically, my beginning of my cycle will be around 36.5 degrees Celsius or lower. 36.6 degrees Celsius like this day is not unusual. It's not anything for me to be concerned about if I do get that. So because it was my first day of my cycle, I had no cervical fluid. So I don't jot down saying no cervical fluid. I just don't talk about cervical fluid. But I do like to detail, because I journal not just to track my cycle to avoid pregnancy or to conceive. I also track my cycle as feedback loops around my health. So I enter in details around my bleed. At the time when I was making this journal entry, I remember I was still using menstrual cups. I haven't used menstrual cups in many months, but the nice thing about a menstrual cup is that you can often see the milliliters in it. So you can almost detail exactly how many milliliters of blood you had during your period, but you're also able to see if there are clots or lining and how's the general viscosity of that bleed. So I enter in those descriptions and I enter in how much bleeding there is. So I will say light, medium, or heavy, or if I have the actual milliliters or the comparison to my cup, I will say half a cup in 12 hours or something like that. But just a little bit of description around my period. In this one, I said red and minimal clots. So not very descriptive in this one. Period pain used to be a real struggle for me. It has not been a struggle in a long time, but I do include in my journal how I feel about that, if there's any pain or if there's anything going on. I noted here that I have some cramp-like feelings and leg feels. My descriptive language is not ideal, but it's for me to understand. The point is I don't experience intense pain the way that I used to. It's more just that I can really feel my uterus is contracting, and sometimes that feeling spreads down to my legs. So that's what I was experiencing, and that is what I wrote. I like to detail that level of pain and what I was experiencing, because I like to compare it for my health reasons to see if my efforts are improving the pain that I was experiencing. And they did improve that because I don't have painful periods anymore. Okay, then under mind, because I usually go body, mind, and then I have supplements or kind of anything that I did that would have an impact on my menstrual cycle or health efforts that I want to note. So under mind, here I had a typical entry for my period, which is that I was experiencing some sensitivity, and I would categorize it to be more on the sad, depressive side than happy and bubbly. Also more internal than external. Moving on to day 2 of my cycle. My temperature was 36.6 degrees Celsius, so still hasn't come down to my average of 36.5 degrees Celsius, but also not a cause for concern. Again, I noted that I had my period, it was red, I noted how much there was in the cup, and I do note a whole bunch of other things I'm not sharing in this video because stuff around, my energy levels and other body things that are not relevant to tracking your menstrual cycle. My mind, I just noted that I was feeling clearer than I was the previous day. All right, cycle day 3. Here my temperature came down to my usual average of 36.5 degrees Celsius. Now this one is going to be a little bit unusual for some people watching this video, but I noted here that I no longer had my period. That means my period lasted a total of 2 days. I spoke about this in my pill video or my preconception video about my light periods. They were not light before I went on the pill. Then I went on the pill, then my bleed disappeared, and I don't want to say never, at the time of making those videos, it had not yet increased, and it was still on the very light end of it. Now, 11 months later, it has increased and I don't have a 2-day period anymore, but even when it was around 2 to 3 days, it wasn't necessarily a health concern. At the time that I made this journal entry, I was still just generally focusing on my health to improve my hormones in the hopes that it will increase my bleed. Eventually, a couple of months after this, I did have my lining measured because I was worried that my lining was too thin, which might be the reason, my uterine lining, which might be the reason for my very light period. I had it measured in my luteal phase, so that's after ovulation, and typically speaking, if it is below 10 millimeters, then it is a potential cause for concern that it might be on the thin side after ovulation. So it is thinner leading up to ovulation. I had mine measured on the 12th day after I'd ovulated, and at the time it was 15 millimeters, and the gynecologist confirmed that it was perfectly healthy for that part of my cycle. Then a few months after that, I had it measured again in a pre-ovulation. I had it measured on cycle day 12 at a different gynecologist, and I shared with this gynecologist my fears about my uterine lining and my light period, and that I have no other indications of hormonal imbalances, but I still have a very light period. And where's that diary? I think it's in this one. She was more than happy to answer all my questions and discuss it. She even went as far as to pictures for me for my journal, which I loved. Right, so there my lining was measured on the 12th day of my cycle, and it was already measuring at a healthy 7.61 millimeters. She also confirmed that it has all of its 3 layers that it needs to have. I don't know if you can tell or see that, but over there. So it appears that my light period has not been an indication of my uterine lining being too thin. It is hard to gauge what the average is, like what is an average person's period, but I can assume that this is on the lighter end to only have a period for 2 days. But it could also be that I don't have substantial bleeding in those 2 days anyway. But this book deems that the average period is 25 to 80 milliliters for that entire period. I think I get like 25 milliliters, or did in this cycle. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to go on a random tangent about my light period, but I've just learned a lot of information about that since journaling it here, and I underlined it in my journal because it was still very much a cause for concern for me at this point. Moving on, there is nothing to note about my mind or my supplements or anything that's relevant to tracking your cycle. Cycle day 4. My temperature was now a nice pre-ovulation temperature of 36.4 degrees Celsius. And we can say that I had entered into my follicular phase by this stage. There's nothing more to note on day 4. Day 5, my temperature was back to 36.6 degrees Celsius. Again, not a cause for concern. It's not very high. It's definitely not a fever, and it's not even close to my luteal phase temperature, so it is fine. I didn't note it here because I don't note the absence of something, but because I was in my follicular phase, I was looking out for cervical fluid, and when my point in change would happen where I would go from dry, as in no cervical fluid, to have some cervical fluid. On day 5, I had no cervical fluid. Day 6 of my cycle, 36.4 degrees Celsius. Also, no cervical fluid, bunch of random stuff that's noted that is not relevant to tracking your cycle. But here, under mind, I can see that I had some very typical follicular phase things going on. I noted that I was very people-orientated, very relationship-orientated, present, and calm. And that is very typical for my follicular phase. It is a wonderful time for me to spend time with people. Day 7, my temperature was 36.3 degrees Celsius. Again, very outward, very social, nice, lots of energy, nothing else to note. Still dry, still no cervical fluid. Day 8 of my cycle, 36.3 degrees Celsius. You can see they're staying consistently low because I have not ovulated yet. Day 8, I entered my point of change, or it was my day of where I had the point of change. And that's where it goes from dry, meaning no cervical fluid, to having some cervical fluid. I described it as being white. When I'm avoiding pregnancy, or when we are using tracking to not conceive, then as soon as I see cervical fluid, I will implement other methods to ensure that pregnancy doesn't take place. But if we are trying to conceive, I will not assume that this type of cervical fluid is fertile, because this type of cervical fluid is white and creamy. But again, if I did not want to get pregnant, I would just assume that it is fertile, because it's probably going to change to my super fertile fluid very quickly. But if I wanted to conceive, I wouldn't get overly excited about seeing white cervical fluid. I hope I'm explaining that well. Again, from a mind perspective, outward, social, very chatty, relaxed, and I even noted that I was frustrated at admin tasks. Admin tasks are for my luteal phase. Moving on to day 9. Day 9, my temperature was 36.5 degrees Celsius. Very normal average temperature for pre-ovulation. Day 9, I noted that I had a general wet sensation when it came to cervical fluid. So see there, it did turn from not so fertile to getting to very fertile very quickly in the span of a day. I also noted that I could feel something in the right ovary. Day 10 of my cycle, my temperature was 36.4 degrees Celsius. I noted that I was feeling some ovary feels, and that I was mildly bloated, and a bunch of other things. Probably TMI, but I'm going to share this in case other women can relate to this. As my body is leading up to ovulation and during ovulation, it just has a stronger smell. A lot of the time I smell like nothing, but leading up to ovulation, my general body odor will just be more. Not a bad thing. I'm not saying I'm stinky. I'm just saying I note here that there's an increase in body odor. Mine, it was the same stuff, being calm, chatty, outward. Day 11, my temperature was still 36.4 degrees Celsius. And here was my first day of very obvious peak cervical fluid or super fertile cervical fluid that looks like a raw egg white. I even noted that there was a lot of it. Obviously, a lot would be a lot for me, not a lot for somebody else. I don't know how much cervical fluid other people have, but I also noted that I saw it 3 times in that day. I don't do LH or ovulation tests every cycle. When I do, I share them on my Instagram when I'm playing around with that information. This cycle happened to be one where I did do LH tests, and I noted that the LH test was negative on day 11 of my cycle. Now, for people trying to conceive, I generally do not recommend only relying on LH tests. I think that tracking your cycle fully with other methods is incredibly helpful when you're trying to conceive. And as you can see here, I was having fertile egg white cervical fluid, meaning that cervical fluid can keep sperm alive until ovulation, and I had not yet had my LH surge. So the LH surge typically happens 24 to 36 hours before you ovulate. But you can still get pregnant when you don't have that surge, but you do have fertile cervical fluid that can keep the sperm alive until the egg is dropped down. Day 12, my temperature was 36.3 degrees Celsius, and I noted that I still had egg white cervical fluid and that I had noted it twice that day. I'd also done an LH test in the morning, and it came back with a faint line. A faint line on an LH test is a negative LH test because the surge is quite intense to trigger ovulation. Then I did it in the evening or at night. I didn't note a particular time on this, and it came back positive. So often people have asked me, can my LH go from negative in the morning to positive at night? It most definitely can. It's also quite easy to miss your LH surge completely if you're solely relying on that and you're not doing LH tests, maybe even twice a day. Moving on to day 13, my temperature was 36.4 degrees Celsius. So note that the previous evening I got my LH surge, and we typically expect ovulation to happen within 24 to 36 hours of that surge. I'd also already had my fertile cervical fluid, which was continuing on day 13 as well. And I noted that I had ovary feels on that day. Still experiencing a positive LH, so sometimes my surge is just longer than other times. Day 14 of my cycle, temperature 36.5 degrees Celsius, so that's still below my usual line in terms of when it will jump after I've ovulated. I noted that I still had the egg white cervical fluid and that I was experiencing a great deal of sensitivity in my nipple area. That is very normal for me around ovulation. I only experience that around ovulation and then it goes away. I classify that one as a secondary sign. I do not rely on it primarily at all, but it is consistently there for me each cycle when I go into my ovulation. Day 15 of my cycle, my temperature increased, not by a lot. It increased to 36.7 degrees Celsius, but I took this as my luteal day 1, meaning day 14 of my cycle I took as ovulation. Typically, to confirm ovulation, we're looking for 3 days of raised temperatures. So we're going to see whether I had those 3 days of raised temperatures. Day 16 of my cycle, 36.7 degrees Celsius. In my temperature video, I spoke about how my post-ovulation temperatures are typically 36.8 degrees Celsius or higher. At the time I was doing this cycle, I was not taking my own advice by leaving the thermometer in there until it's done climbing. Whenever it used to beep, I just took it out, even though I knew that it did impact the accuracy to some degree. So I did notice that my charts before I started doing that are slightly lower and have a little bit of variation relative to my charts currently. Day 17 of my cycle, so this is the 3rd day after ovulation, and my temperature was up to 36.9 degrees Celsius. So that is 3 days of raised temperatures. Obviously, ideally, I would have liked to see a bigger jump between pre-ovulation and post-ovulation, and I'm going to put that down to me not using the thermometer correctly, but maybe it was something else. I also noted here, and it will probably feature in most of the pages for the remainder of my luteal phase, that I just kind of put an arrow going upwards, meaning an increased orientation towards tasks. My luteal phase is an amazing time for admin tasks. Day 18 of my cycle, my temperature was 36.8 degrees Celsius. So we can see that it's staying high. Forgot to mention, because I don't note the absence of something, that as of day 16 of my cycle, I had no more cervical fluid. It went back to being dry completely after having cervical fluid for my fertile window. So day 18, we had 36.8 degrees Celsius. Day 19, 37 degrees Celsius. All very much just normal luteal phase things for me. One thing I would like to note here, I've spoken about my PMS in other videos. This is a lot better now, but at the time of journaling this, so note here, we are 5 days after ovulation at this point, day 19 of my cycle, and I had already noted that my boobs were swollen and sore. So part of my health efforts has been to try to minimize the PMS that I experience, specifically when it comes to breast swelling and pain. Day 20 of my cycle, my temperature was 37 degrees Celsius. I still had the swollen boobs and some other body stuff that isn't relevant. Day 21 of my cycle, 36.8 degrees Celsius. And here I spoke about this in my How Not to Get Pregnant video, where sometimes you will see fluid in your luteal phase, but it is not cervical fluid. It is white and creamy, and it is just part of the vagina's function. And here I noted that I had white and creamy fluid, but I knew that this was a time that I was not fertile, and it was fine for me to have sex in this time without thinking that it's going to lead to pregnancy. If I hadn't confirmed ovulation yet, then I would feel different about any fluid. But given that I had confirmed ovulation and I knew that that window had closed, I felt comfortable that this fluid was not cervical fluid. Day 22 of my cycle, 36.8 degrees Celsius. We can see it is remaining high. Nothing noteworthy to mention other than I was still experiencing painful swollen boobs. And that is that for this one, and I continued it in my next one. Day 23 of my cycle, my temperature was 36.9 degrees Celsius. I still had some of that white creamy fluid. Day 24 of my cycle, temperature staying up there, 36.8 degrees Celsius. Nothing to note here other than I was still in a very task-orientated phase, getting a lot of my admin done. This is 10 days after ovulation, so I can typically expect to get my period from the 13th day after I ovulated up to the 15th day after I ovulate. Day 25 of my cycle, so this is the 11th day after I ovulated. My temperature was 36.8 degrees Celsius. Only thing noteworthy here is that I noted that I was intense and absorbed, which is very typical for me in this phase. I get very intensely absorbed in tasks. Day 26 of my cycle, so here I'm still not expecting my period at all. My temperature is 36.8 degrees Celsius. Day 27 of my cycle, so now this is the 13th day after I ovulated. I can potentially expect my period on this day, the next day, or the next day. I didn't get it because otherwise this would have changed to cycle day 1. This is still cycle day 27 with a temperature of 36.9 degrees Celsius. Still swollen and sore breasts. Other than that, nothing noteworthy. Day 28 of my cycle, my temperature went slightly down to 36.7 degrees Celsius. That's usually an indication that the day after that, my bleed will come. Nothing else noteworthy there. And the next day, my bleed came. So the next day, I scratched out where I wrote day 29 and I turned it to day 1 because a new cycle starts as soon as the bleed arrives. And that is a typical cycle for me, or at least that was my cycle from May 2021. And you could see that it was a little bit raised when it started, and then it stayed more or less around 36.5 degrees Celsius or lower. My point of change was around cycle day 8, where I started seeing cervical fluid. I had fertile cervical fluid from cycle day 11. I ovulated on cycle day 14. I got that temperature jump. It's not the best temperature jump, could have been higher there, but then my temperatures remained consistently high throughout my luteal phase and dropped just slightly before I started a new cycle. Not only was that a typical cycle for me, but you can see that I also picked one that is typically 28 days and that I ovulated on day 14. So although that does reflect the very typical menstrual cycle, I do not always ovulate on day 14 and I do not always have a 28-day cycle. I have a very regular cycle, but that still doesn't mean that it is exactly on those days and those number of days each time, and therefore, as always, I'm recommending that you do not count days, but rather record what you are observing taking place in your body and go along with that. I hope that this practical example of taking you through a typical cycle for me was helpful, and I look forward to bringing you more content on the fertility awareness, tracking my cycle to avoid pregnancy, to conceive, to get feedback loops on my health, or just to generally live more in sync with my cycle. So if that is something you enjoy seeing, please remember to subscribe to my channel, and if you enjoyed this video, please comment down below and give me some feedback and give this video a thumbs up.